There's a specific kind of silence that drops over a room full of apex predators when something breaks the natural order. It's not a quiet silence. It's a vacuum. All the air gets sucked out, leaving you suffocating under a dozen alpha stares. That's exactly what happened when a 5-year-old boy ran across the private dining room of a 5-star restaurant, climbed into my lap, and called me Papa. The problem? I was just the assistant. The bigger problem? His actual father was my boss. You don't survive in corporate equity as an Omega by being soft. You survive by being entirely uninteresting. For 3 years, that was my strategy. My name is Leo. I woke up at 5 in the morning, swallowed a chalky medical-grade suppressant that left a permanent metallic taste at the back of my throat, and sprayed my pulse points with a chemical neutralizer. I wore charcoal suits that hid the lines of my body. I spoke in a flat, measured baritone. I was a machine built for scheduling, crisis management, and making Arthur Pendleton's life seamless. Arthur was the CEO of Pendleton Capital. He was also an alpha, though he didn't wear it like a weapon the way the rest of the board did. He didn't have to. Arthur possessed a quiet, dense gravity. When he walked into a room, the air pressure shifted. People stopped talking. He never raised his voice, never bared his teeth, and never engaged in the petty scent wars that plagued the executive floor. He just observed, calculated, and executed. I respected him. More dangerously, I trusted him. Leo. I looked up from my tablet. We were in the back of his town car, the city flashing by in streaks of neon and gray rain. Arthur was staring at his phone, his brow furrowed. He smelled faintly of ozone and cedar, a sharp, clean scent that always managed to cut through the stale air of the vehicle. The Q3 reports are finalized, I said, preempting his usual question. And I pushed the meeting with the Japanese delegates to Thursday. They were surprisingly accommodating. That's not it, Arthur said. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper today. It's Mrs. Gable. She's sick. Flu, she thinks. Mrs. Gable was the nanny, which meant this wasn't a Pendleton Capital problem. It was a Toby problem. Toby was Arthur's 5-year-old son. He was a bright, chaotic little boy with his father's dark hair and an absolute refusal to conform to a schedule. He was also the only reason I ever breached the invisible wall between my professional and personal life. When Mrs. Gable had appointments, or when Arthur was stuck in emergency board meetings, I was the one who picked Toby up from preschool. I kept an extra box of generic crayons in my desk drawer. I knew exactly which brand of apple juice Toby tolerated. I can reroute the car, I said immediately. My fingers were already moving across the screen. We can pick him up from school. You have a 2-hour window before the prep meeting for tonight's dinner. Arthur finally looked at me. His eyes were a pale, striking gray. They had a way of anchoring you to the floor. You're already managing the merger details, Leo. You don't need to play babysitter on top of your actual job. It's not babysitting if he sits in my office and draws pictures of dinosaurs while I draft emails, I replied smoothly. Besides, if you go home now, Graham will use your absence to corner the acquisitions team. You need to be in the building. A muscle feathered in Arthur's jaw at the mention of Graham. Graham was the senior vice president, an alpha who reeked of old money, stale bourbon, and ambition. He wanted Arthur's seat. Tonight's dinner was the final hurdle in a massive merger, and Graham was hovering like a vulture, waiting for a misstep. Fine, Arthur sighed, the tension in his shoulders relaxing just a fraction. Thank you, Leo. I mean it. It's my job, sir. He held my gaze for a second too long. Is it? I didn't answer. I just tapped the glass partition and gave the driver the address for Toby's school. An hour later, Toby was sitting cross-legged on the floor of my office, aggressively coloring a T-Rex with a purple crayon. He was a quiet kid, incredibly observant, and fiercely protective of his routine. Mr. Leo, Toby said without looking up. Dad is wearing his grumpy face today. Your dad is stressed, Tobe, I said, typing rapidly. He has a big dinner tonight, a lot of important people. Are you going? I have to. I'm his assistant. I have to make sure he has all his notes and that nobody gives him the fish because you know how he feels about fish. Toby giggled. He hates it. He says it smells like the bottom of a boat. He paused, dropping the crayon. He looked up at me, his large eyes serious. I don't want to go to Aunt Sarah's tonight. Her house smells like cats. Can I stay with you? My chest tightened. It was a familiar, unwelcome ache. The suppressants kept my biology in check, but they couldn't suppress the deeply human instinct to comfort a kid who just wanted some stability. Arthur's late wife had passed away when Toby was a baby. It was just the two of them, and by proximity, me. I'll be at the dinner, buddy, I said softly, stepping away from the desk to crouch down beside him. I handed him a green crayon. But I promise, I'll tell your dad to come get you the second it's over. Toby took the crayon, his little fingers brushing against mine. He leaned forward and pressed his face into my shoulder for a brief, tight hug. Even through my scent blockers, I could smell the faint, milky sweetness of a young pup. Okay, he mumbled. I patted his back, feeling entirely out of my depth. I was an Omega in a shark tank playing a dangerous game of proximity with an alpha CEO and his son. I knew the boundaries. I knew the rules. I just didn't realize how close I was to breaking them. The private dining room at Le Bernardin felt less like a restaurant and more like an arena. The walls were paneled in dark, acoustic wood that swallowed the sound of the city outside, trapping us in with the clinking of crystal glasses and the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of dominant pheromones. There were 12 men at the table, 11 alphas and me. I sat slightly behind Arthur, a shadow with a tablet. My skin itched. I had doubled my dose of neutralizer before we left the office, but the sheer concentration of alpha energy in the room was making my temples throb. It felt like standing in the middle of a thunderstorm with a metal rod. Across the table, Graham was holding court. He was leaning back in his chair, swirling an amber liquid in his glass, his scent rolling off him in aggressive, peppery waves. He was trying to dominate the room without saying a word. Arthur wasn't taking the bait. He sat perfectly still, his posture relaxed but commanding. He was discussing the logistics of the supply chain integration with the CEO of the merging company, a man named Henderson. Arthur's scent, cedar and ozone, was contained. He was completely in control. It all comes down to risk management, Graham interjected loudly, interrupting Henderson. He smiled, showing entirely too many teeth. We have to ask ourselves if Pendleton Capital is capable of handling a transition of this magnitude. It requires uncompromised focus, late nights, constant availability. Graham's eyes flicked to Arthur. Some might wonder if a single father has the necessary bandwidth. Family is important, Arthur, but this deal is paramount. We can't afford distractions. The room went entirely still. The underlying hum of conversation died. It was a blatant, ugly attack. Graham was using Arthur's widower status and his son as a weapon to make him look weak to the new partners. My grip on my tablet tightened until my knuckles turned white. My jaw ached from clenching it. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to tell Graham to shut his mouth. But I was the Omega assistant. If I spoke out of turn, I would only prove Graham's point about Arthur lacking control over his own house. I looked at Arthur. His expression didn't change, but I saw the slight flecks of his hand on the linen tablecloth. Before Arthur could respond, my phone vibrated in my breast pocket, a sharp, continuous buzz. I pulled it out discreetly, shielding the screen. It was Arthur's sister, Sarah. Emergency, the text read. Toby broke his arm at the playground. On our way to St. Jude's ER, he's crying for you guys. My blood ran cold. The noise of the room faded into a dull roar. I didn't hesitate. I leaned forward, my chest brushing against the back of Arthur's chair. I lowered my voice so only he could hear. Sir, it's Sarah. Toby had an accident, a broken arm. They're at St. Jude's. Arthur froze. For a fraction of a second, the carefully constructed mask of the CEO slipped, and I saw the sheer, raw panic of a father. His scent flared, a sudden, sharp spike of ozone that crackled in the air. Several alphas at the table flinched, their heads snapping toward Arthur as his pheromones spiked. Arthur stood up. The movement was sudden enough to scrape the heavy wooden chair loudly against the floor. Gentlemen, he said, his voice hard and flat. I apologize. There has been a family emergency. I need to leave immediately. Graham's eyes lit up with triumph. He leaned forward, smelling blood in the water. Be reasonable. We are at the final hour here. Surely the nanny can handle a scraped knee. You walk out now. You're telling Henderson that Pendleton Capital isn't a priority. My son is in the hospital, Graham, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating octave. This dinner is over for me. Then the deal is over, Graham shot back, slamming his palm on the table. You're proving my point, Arthur. You're compromised. You can't lead a multi-billion-dollar acquisition if you drop everything every time your kid cries. The silence in the room was suffocating. Henderson looked deeply uncomfortable. Graham looked victorious. Arthur stood there, trapped. If he left, Graham would poison the well, tank the deal, and likely initiate a vote of no confidence with the board. If he stayed, his son was in an emergency room without him. I didn't think. I just acted. I stood up, stepping out from behind Arthur's shadow. I didn't look at Graham. I looked directly at Arthur. I'll go, I said. My voice was steady, cutting through the heavy air. I'll go to St. Jude's. I know his medical history. I know his pediatrician's direct line. And Sarah is already there. You stay and close this deal. Arthur turned to me. His eyes were wild, conflicted. Leo, I can't ask you to... You didn't ask. I'm going, I said, holding his gaze. He trusts me. I'll call you the second I have an update from the doctor. Finish this, Arthur. I didn't wait for his permission. I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room. I could feel Graham's sneer burning into my back, but I didn't care. I ran through the restaurant lobby, bursting out into the cold, rainy street, already waving down a cab. My heart was pounding against my ribs, an erratic rhythm that had nothing to do with corporate mergers. Toby was hurt. I needed to get to him. The emergency room at St. Jude's smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. I found Sarah in the pediatric waiting area, pacing frantically. Toby was sitting on a hospital bed behind a curtain, clutching his left arm to his chest, his face pale and tear-streaked. The second he saw me, he let out a jagged sob. Leo! I bypassed the nurse and went straight to the bed, dropping to my knees. Hey, buddy, I'm here. I've got you. It hurts, he cried, burying his face in my neck. I know. The doctors are going to fix it. You're being so brave. I smoothed his hair down, projecting as much calm as I could muster. Your dad wanted to be here so badly, Tobe, but he had to make sure the bad guys didn't take over his castle at work. He sent me to guard you until he gets here. That seemed to help. Over the next 2 hours, I held Toby's good hand while the doctor set the bone and wrapped it in a bright blue cast. I filled out the insurance paperwork. I fetched apple juice. I sat with him while the pain medication kicked in and made his eyelids heavy. By the time I got the text from Arthur, deal closed. Graham is contained. Where are you? Toby was asleep against my side. ER Bay 4. He's okay. Blue cast. Sleeping? I texted back. 20 minutes later, Arthur walked through the ER doors. He was still in his bespoke suit, completely out of place among the tired parents and fluorescent lights. He looked exhausted, the adrenaline of the boardroom crashing out of him. He saw us and stopped. I was sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, leaning back against the wall, with Toby tucked securely under my arm. Arthur walked over slowly. He didn't say a word. He just reached out and gently touched Toby's uninjured shoulder. Then he looked at me. The intensity in his gray eyes was overwhelming. It wasn't the look of a CEO. It was the look of a man who realized exactly what was holding his world together. Thank you, he whispered. You got the deal, I whispered back. I did. He hesitated, his hand hovering over Toby. The board is having a celebratory breakfast at the hotel tomorrow. Wives, families, a show of unity for the Henderson team. He swallowed hard. I'm supposed to bring him. I looked down at Toby. He'll be fine by morning. Kids bounce back. The doctor said he can go to school on Monday. Arthur shook his head slightly. That's not what I mean. He looked at me, his gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before meeting my eyes again. I want you there, Leo. I usually manage the catering for those events from the office. Not as my assistant, Arthur interrupted, his voice low, vibrating with an alpha command that made my breath hitch. With us. At the table, I stared at him. The neutralizers on my skin felt suddenly useless. The heat radiating from his hand, resting inches from mine on the hospital bed, was magnetic. Arthur, that's not... People will talk. Graham will talk. Let him, Arthur said flatly. The next morning, the banquet hall at the Plaza Hotel was a sea of pastel dresses, tailored suits, and morning mimosas. It was a performance. Everyone was smiling, shaking hands, playing the role of the perfect corporate family. I felt like an imposter. I was wearing a dark navy suit, walking a half step behind Arthur. Toby, sporting his new blue cast, was holding my left hand. He had refused to let go since we got out of the car. We approached the main table. Henderson was there with his wife. And Graham. Graham's eyes narrowed the moment he saw me. He noted my hand holding Toby's, and the smug, victorious smile returned to his face. He thought he had found the weakness. He thought he had found the scandal. "Arthur!" Graham boomed, standing up. "Glad you could make it. And little Toby, looking like a warrior." Graham's eyes slid to me. And Leo, always on the clock. I didn't realize Pendleton Capital mandated weekend babysitting duties for our administrative staff. The conversation at the surrounding tables dropped. People turned their heads. It was the same tactic as the night before, a public shaming designed to put Arthur in his place. I started to pull my hand away from Toby's, ready to step back, to take the hit and retreat into my role as the invisible Omega. Toby tightened his grip. He looked up at Graham, his little brow furrowed. "He's not a babysitter." Graham chuckled condescendingly. "Oh? Then why is he here, buddy?" Toby didn't hesitate. He looked at Graham with the exact same unbothered, dense gravity his father possessed. "Because he's my papa," Toby said clearly, his voice carrying across the quiet room. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum, a complete cessation of air. I stopped breathing. The blood rushed to my ears in a deafening roar. I stared down at Toby, paralyzed. Graham blinked, his smirk faltering. He looked from Toby to me and then to Arthur. He let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "You're... Papa. Well, that's certainly an unconventional arrangement, Arthur. I wasn't aware your assistant was part of the family package. I suppose that explains why he was so eager to run to the hospital last night." Graham leaned forward, his scent turning bitter and mocking. "Does HR know about this little corporate synergy?" I waited for Arthur to deny it. I waited for him to correct Toby, to gently explain that I was just an employee, a friend, a temporary fix to a permanent problem. I waited to be put back in my box. Arthur didn't flinch. He stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of me, shielding both me and Toby from Graham. The air in the room suddenly grew heavy. It wasn't an aggressive spike of pheromones. It was a slow, overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated alpha dominance. It rolled over the table, pressing down on everyone in the room. Henderson actually took a step back. Graham froze, his mouth half open. "He called him Papa," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a register that vibrated in the floorboards, "because Leo is family." Arthur turned his head, looking at me. The mask was entirely gone. What was left was raw, undeniable possession. He looked back at Graham, his eyes like chipped ice. "Leo isn't a package deal, Graham. He is the foundation. He kept my son safe. He keeps my life running. He is exactly where he belongs." Arthur stepped closer to the table, looming over Graham. "The real question here is why you are consistently struggling to mind your own business, Graham. If you have a problem with how my family operates, we can nullify your contract right now and you can leave." Graham's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was completely, utterly silenced. Arthur held his stare for 3 long seconds, ensuring the submission was complete. Then he turned away. He looked at me, reached out, and placed his hand on the small of my back. His touch burned through my suit jacket. "Come on," Arthur said softly, ignoring the stunned room. "Let's get Toby some pancakes." I spent 3 years building a fortress of color-coded spreadsheets and polite detachment. It took a 5-year-old with a blue cast exactly 3 seconds to dismantle it. The rest of the breakfast was a blur of syrupy pancakes and strained smiles. Henderson, ever the pragmatist, immediately pivoted the conversation to golf handicaps, expertly ignoring the smoking crater Graham had left behind. Arthur played along, his tone cordial, but his hand never moved from the back of my chair. It rested there, a heavy, radiating brand of ownership that short-circuited my nervous system. When we finally escaped to the waiting town car, the silence between us was loud. Toby was asleep before the driver even pulled out of the hotel roundabout, his head slumped heavily against my thigh. I stared out the window at the morning traffic, trying to regulate my breathing. My suppressants were failing. The metallic taste in the back of my throat was gone, replaced by the deep, resonant scent of Arthur's cedar and ozone. It was pooling in the back seat, thick and protective. "You're overthinking," Arthur said. His voice startled me. I looked over. He was watching me, his suit jacket discarded on the leather seat next to him, his tie loosened. He looked tired, but the tension that had plagued him for the last month was completely gone. "I'm calculating," I corrected, keeping my voice low so as not to wake Toby. "Graham is going to file a grievance, fraternization, abuse of power. He's going to say you coerced an Omega subordinate into domestic duties to mask your own incompetence as a single father." Arthur let out a dry, humorless exhale. "Let him try. The board just watched me finalize a $2 billion merger. They don't care who cuts my son's crusts off his toast." "It's not about the board, Arthur. It's about optics." I rubbed my temple. A dull headache was beginning to pound behind my eyes. "I am your executive assistant. I manage your calendar, not your child. Today, in front of the most important people in this firm, you validated a fantasy. You called me family." "It wasn't a fantasy, Leo." He shifted, closing the distance between us on the wide leather seat. His knee brushed against mine. I stiffened, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't. "Do you know why Graham targets you?" Arthur asked, his gray eyes locking onto mine. "It's not because you're an Omega. He works with plenty of Omegas. It's because he sees what everyone else in that building sees. You don't just work for me. You anticipate me. You anchor me. When I am in a room with you, I don't have to watch my back." He reached out. His fingers hovered over my hand, which was resting on Toby's cast. He didn't touch me, but the heat of his proximity made my skin prickle. "Graham isn't attacking you to get to me," Arthur continued softly. "He's attacking you because he knows you are the only real vulnerability I have. If you leave, I don't just lose a good assistant. I lose the person who makes this life manageable." My throat tightened. "Arthur, I meant what I said in there," he interrupted, his voice dropping to that dangerous, vibrating register. "You are not a package deal. You are the foundation. I won't let him touch you, and I won't apologize for claiming what is mine to protect." Claiming. The word hung in the air, heavy with biological implications. My pulse skyrocketed. Alphas claimed, Omegas submitted. It was an archaic, primal dynamic that we were all supposed to have evolved past, buried under layers of corporate policy and HR handbooks. But sitting in the back of the car, with his son asleep on my lap and his scent wrapping around me like a physical shield, the modern world felt very far away. I looked away first. I had to. If I kept looking at him, I was going to do something stupid, like lean into his space and let him finish closing the distance. "I'll draft a preemptive memo to HR," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "detailing my voluntary assistance with Toby during emergency hours. We need a paper trail." Arthur watched me for a long moment. He saw exactly what I was doing, retreating back behind the armor of bureaucracy. He sighed, leaning back against his door. "Draft whatever you need, Leo, but the paper trail won't change the truth." Monday morning arrived with the subtlety of a car crash. I stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor, clutching 2 cups of black coffee. The air was thick, Usually the bullpen smelled of stale espresso and dry cleaning chemicals. Today, it smelled like fear. The moment I walked past the reception desk, the whispering stopped. Heads ducked behind monitors. I kept my face blank, a perfect mask of Omega indifference, and walked straight to my desk outside Arthur's closed office door. Sitting in my chair was a thick manila envelope. I set the coffees down and opened it. It was a formal summons from Human Resources, a grievance hearing, initiated by Graham. Scheduled for 10 a.m. I checked my watch. It was 9:15. Arthur's door clicked open. He stepped out, looking immaculate in a charcoal three-piece suit. He took one look at my face, then at the envelope in my hand. His jaw locked. The air pressure in the room immediately dropped. "I'm going to fire him," Arthur said evenly. "You can't," I replied, sliding the summons back into the envelope. I handed him his coffee. "Not without cause. And right now, to the board, he's a dedicated VP who is concerned about his CEO's judgment and potential HR liabilities. He's a parasite. He's a parasite with a 15% equity stake," I reminded him. I took a sip of my coffee. The caffeine hit my empty stomach like battery acid. "Let me handle this." Arthur frowned. "Leo, you don't have to go into a room and let them interrogate you. I am the head of your administrative staff. Handling crises is in my job description." I looked up at him, allowing a sharp, cynical smile to touch my lips. "Besides, Graham thinks I'm soft. He thinks because I take suppressants and speak quietly, I'm easy prey." I opened my bottom drawer and pulled out a heavy encrypted hard drive. I dropped it into my briefcase with a satisfying thud. He's forgotten who manages the expense accounts. At exactly 10 a.m., I walked into the glass-walled HR conference room. The head of HR, a beta named Davis, looked deeply uncomfortable. Graham sat across from him, practically vibrating with smug anticipation. "Leo," Davis said softly, "please sit down. We're here to discuss a delicate matter regarding your professional boundaries with Mr. Pendleton." I didn't sit. I placed my briefcase on the table and clicked the locks open. The sharp snaps echoed loudly in the quiet room. "Let's save time, Davis," I said, my voice projecting clearly. "Graham has filed a complaint alleging an inappropriate, non-consensual dynamic between myself and the CEO, specifically regarding unpaid childcare and coerced domestic duties." Graham smirked. "It's a textbook liability, Leo. We're just looking out for the firm. And for you. No Omega should be forced to play house to keep their job." I pulled a stack of heavily bound files from my briefcase and dropped them onto the table. They hit the wood with a heavy smack. "These," I said, tapping the top file, "are my time logs for the past 3 years. Every hour spent with Toby Pendleton outside of normal business hours has been logged, coded as Executive Crisis Management, and compensated at time and a half, approved by the external payroll auditor." Graham's smirk faltered slightly. "Furthermore," I continued, pulling out a second thinner file and sliding it across the table to Davis. "These are Graham's expense reports for the last 4 fiscal quarters. I found some interesting discrepancies. Client dinners billed to the firm that took place while the clients were out of the country. A series of consulting fees paid to a shell corporation registered to his brother-in-law. And my personal favorite, a $70,000 charge for a team-building retreat in Aspen where he was the only attendee." The room went dead silent. Graham turned paper white. The scent of sour, panicked alpha flooded the room. You can't just access those," Graham stammered, his bravado instantly evaporating. "I am the CEO's executive assistant. I have clearance for every financial document in this building," I said coldly. I looked at Davis, who was staring at the files in horror. "Davis, as I see it, you have 2 options. You can continue this baseless inquiry into my entirely legal documented overtime, or you can open an immediate investigation into corporate fraud and embezzlement by a senior vice president." I finally sat down, folding my hands neatly on the table. I looked directly at Graham. "Your move." 10 minutes later, I walked out of the conference room. Graham was still sitting inside, sweating through his custom shirt, while Davis made frantic calls to the legal department. When I got back to my desk, Arthur was leaning against it, his arms crossed. He looked at me, an eyebrow raised. "Well?" he asked. "Graham will be taking an indefinite leave of absence. Effective immediately," I said, sitting down and opening my laptop as if I hadn't just executed a corporate assassination. "I suggest you prepare a statement for the board regarding his sudden desire to spend more time with his family." Arthur stared at me. The look in his eyes shifted from amusement to something dark, heavy, and intensely reverent. It was the way an alpha looked at an equal. "You're terrifying," Arthur murmured. "I'm efficient," I corrected. Arthur stepped closer. He reached out and gently tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered on the sensitive skin of my neck, right over my scent gland. "You're brilliant," he corrected back, his voice thick. My breath hitched. The adrenaline from the meeting vanished, instantly replaced by a deep, terrifying biological spike. My core temperature flared. I pulled away, turning my face toward my screen. "I have emails to draft, Arthur." He let his hand drop, but he didn't move away. "Take the rest of the day off, Leo. Go home. You've won." "I don't need a break," I snapped, harsher than I intended. The room was suddenly spinning. The suppressants weren't just failing anymore. They were actively fighting my body, and my body was winning. Arthur's brow furrowed. He leaned in, his nose brushing the air near my neck. He inhaled sharply. "Leo," he said, his voice suddenly tight with alarm. "You're burning up." I made it to the executive washroom before my legs gave out. I slammed the heavy wooden door shut, locked it, and gripped the edge of the marble sink. My reflection in the mirror was a stranger. My skin was flushed, my pupils were blown wide, and my chest was heaving. It was a heat flush. The first stage. I hadn't had a natural cycle in 5 years. The chemical neutralizers were designed to completely suppress the biological rhythm, keeping an omega flatlined and manageable. But the suppressants relied on a stable baseline. They couldn't combat the perfect storm of extreme stress, adrenaline, and the constant suffocating proximity of a protective alpha claiming me in front of a room of rivals. My body had registered Arthur's defensive behavior as a mating trigger. The biology was overriding the pharmacy. I fumbled in my pocket, pulling out a blister pack of emergency blockers. I popped 2 pills into my palm, threw them to the back of my throat, and drank straight from the faucet. I just needed 20 minutes. 20 minutes for the chemicals to kick in, and I could pack my briefcase, call a cab, and lock myself in my apartment for 3 days. A sharp knock on the door made me jump. "Leo, open the door." It was Arthur. His voice wasn't a request. It was an alpha command laced with a heavy, frantic edge. "I'm fine," I called out, my voice betraying me by cracking down the middle. "Just a migraine. Give me a minute." "You're not fine. I can smell you through the wood, Leo. The whole floor is going to smell you in 5 minutes. Open the door." Panic clawed at my throat. If the bullpen caught wind of an Omega in preheat, it would be a circus. The corporate sharks would smell blood. Graham's rumors would be vindicated in the worst possible way. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door. Arthur pushed inside immediately, shutting and locking the door behind him. The small space instantly became a pressure cooker of pheromones. His scent, usually a crisp, controlled cedar, was wild, thick, and suffocatingly protective. He took one look at me and swore under his breath. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the room, grabbed my shoulders, and hauled me against his chest. "Arthur, stop!" I gasped, trying to push him away. Touching him was like throwing gasoline on a fire. The heat in my blood spiked so hard my vision blurred. "You're making it worse. Your blockers are failing," he said, his voice vibrating against my ear. He held me tight, wrapping his arms around me, burying his face in the crook of my neck. He was deliberately suffocating my scent with his own, masking the sweet, distressed omega pheromones with heavy, dominant alpha. "I took pills," I whimpered, my hands gripping the lapels of his suit. My knees were entirely useless. If he wasn't holding me, I would be on the floor. "They won't work fast enough," Arthur's hands were broad and hot against my back. He was breathing heavily, fighting his own biological urge to completely claim an Omega dropping into heat in his arms. The restraint rolling off him was staggering. "We need to get you out of here," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. "My private elevator is 10 feet down the hall. It goes straight to the parking garage. My car is waiting. I need to go home," I mumbled, my head falling against his shoulder. "I'm not putting you in a cab in this condition," Arthur said fiercely. "You're coming to my place. It's secure. You can ride it out in the guest wing. No one will bother you. Toby is at school, and Sarah is picking him up to take him to her house for a sleepover tonight anyway. It's just us." He pulled back slightly, just enough to look at my face. His gray eyes were entirely dilated, reduced to thin rings of color around pitch-black pupils. The CEO was gone. Only the Alpha remained, hyper-focused on the safety of the Omega in his arms. "Can you walk?" he asked. I nodded weakly. He didn't trust me. He kept one arm firmly around my waist, practically carrying me out of the bathroom. The hallway was empty thanks to the sheer terror he had instilled during the HR debacle. We made it to the private elevator, the doors sliding shut and cutting us off from the corporate world. The ride down to the garage was agonizing. I was burning up from the inside, my skin hypersensitive to the brush of his wool suit against my arm. Every time he inhaled, I felt the phantom pull of a bite on my neck. When we reached his penthouse 20 minutes later, I was delirious. Arthur half carried me into the massive, sunlit living room. He bypassed the guest wing entirely. Instead, he carried me straight into his own bedroom, a massive space that smelled entirely, overwhelmingly of him. He laid me down on the center of the bed. The sheets were cool against my flushed skin, but the scent of him embedded in the pillows sent a sharp ache straight to my core. "Arthur," I choked out, curling into a tight ball. You shouldn't be in here." "I'm not leaving you," he said. He stripped off his suit jacket, throwing it on a chair, and rolled up his sleeves. He went into the adjoining bathroom and came back with a cold, wet towel. He sat on the edge of the bed and gently pressed the towel against my forehead, my cheeks, the burning skin of my neck. "You're crossing a line," I whispered, my eyes falling shut. "We can't go back from this." Arthur's hand paused. He stroked his thumb across my cheekbone, his touch agonizingly tender. "Leo?" he said softly, the rough edge of the Alpha command melting away into something impossibly vulnerable. "I haven't wanted to go back for a very long time. I was just waiting for you to stop running." I opened my eyes, looking at him through the haze of fever. "I'm not running," I said. Arthur smiled, a small, genuine expression that made my heart shatter in my chest. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against mine, letting his scent wash over me, not as a shield this time, but as a promise. "I know," he whispered. "I've got you. A biological heat isn't a romance novel trope. It isn't a soft, hazy sequence of whispered confessions and rose petals. It is a violent, systemic hijacking of the central nervous system. It's a fever that cooks you from the inside out, reducing a rational, educated adult down to a knot of raw nerve endings and desperate clawing instinct. I spent the first 24 hours in purgatory. My body fought the remnants of the chemical blockers, punishing me for years of suppression. The pain in my joints was blinding. The fever spiked and crashed, leaving me shivering violently one minute and kicking the heavy duvet off the next. Through it all, the scent of cedar and ozone was the only thing that kept me tethered to the earth. Arthur didn't leave the room. He didn't claim me. He didn't take advantage of the chemical cocktail turning my brain into static. He functioned as a physical anchor. When the fever spiked so high I started crying silently into the pillows, he climbed onto the mattress. He pulled me against his chest, wrapping his arms tightly around my trembling frame, pressing his face into my sweat-damp hair. He released steady, heavy pulses of calming alpha pheromones, forcefully regulating my erratic heart rate with his own. He fed me ice chips. He forced me to drink water. He wiped down my burning skin with a cool cloth. On the evening of the second day, the fever finally cracked. I woke up, the air in the room feeling distinctly cooler, the suffocating pressure in my skull reduced to a dull, manageable ache. The room was dark, save for the amber glow of the city lights bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Arthur was sitting in a heavy armchair in the corner of the room. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a dark t-shirt. He looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, and a heavy shadow of stubble covered his jaw. He was staring at the floor, a glass of water resting in his hands. I shifted on the bed. The sheets rustled loudly in the quiet room. Arthur's head snapped up. His eyes, completely black just a day ago, had returned to their pale, striking gray. He set the glass down and was at the edge of the bed in 2 strides. "Leo." His voice was gravelly, ruined by lack of sleep. "How do you feel?" "Like I got hit by a train," I croaked. My throat felt like sandpaper. And then the train reversed to check on me. A short, breathless laugh punched its way out of his chest. The tension in his shoulders dropped a fraction. He reached for a fresh glass of water on the nightstand, slipped a hand behind my neck, and helped me sit up to drink. The water was the best thing I had ever tasted. I drained the glass and leaned back against the headboard. Arthur stayed sitting on the edge of the mattress. "You stayed," I said. It wasn't a question. "I told you I wouldn't leave. An alpha in a room with a dropped Omega?" I looked at him, feeling the cynical edge of my usual defenses trying to rebuild themselves, but they were weak and brittle. "Biology says you should have lost your mind." "Biology doesn't dictate my respect for you," Arthur said flatly. "You were sick, Leo. You were in pain. I'm not a monster, and you are not a piece of meat." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before he gently brushed a damp strand of hair off my forehead. The touch sent a warm, heavy shiver down my spine, but it wasn't the frantic, agonizing spike of the heat. It was just deep, resonant comfort. "I ruined your sheets," I muttered, looking away, suddenly hyper-aware of the state I was in. I was wearing one of his t-shirts. It swallowed me whole and smelled aggressively of him. "I can buy new sheets." Arthur's hand moved down, his knuckles lightly grazing my jawline. He guided my face back so I was looking at him. "Why didn't you tell me the suppressants were failing?" "Because if I admitted they were failing, I would have to admit why." "And why was that?" I swallowed hard. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. I was stripped bare. The corporate armor was gone. The chemical armor was gone. It was just me, sitting in his bed, breathing his air. "Because," I started, my voice barely a whisper, "when you stood in front of Graham and told him I was family, my body believed you. The suppressants need a baseline of detachment to work. I don't have that with you anymore. I haven't for a long time." Arthur's eyes darkened. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. He stopped when our faces were inches apart, sharing the same breath. "I meant every word I said to Graham," Arthur murmured, his gaze dropping to my lips before rising to meet my eyes. "You anchor me, Leo. You love my son. You fight for us. I don't want a perfectly detached assistant. I want the man who marched into an emergency room and then gutted my biggest rival with an expense report." He closed the final distance. The kiss wasn't a spark. It was a landslide. It was slow, heavy, and deliberate. Arthur's large hand cupped the back of my neck, holding me steady, while his mouth moved against mine with a devastating mixture of reverence and absolute possession. A low, rumbling growl vibrated in the back of his throat, a sound of profound relief and rightness that vibrated straight through my chest. I slid my hands up into his hair, gripping the dark strands, pulling him closer. The last of my cynical walls crumbled to dust. I tasted salt and realized one of us was crying. I didn't care who. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing heavily. Arthur rested his forehead against mine, his thumb stroking the pulse point at my throat. "You're mine," he whispered. It wasn't a threat. It was a vow. Yeah, I breathed back, closing my eyes. I know. The real world didn't vanish just because my heat broke. It was waiting for us right outside the door, armed with legal threats, corporate gossip, and a 5-year-old with a broken arm. On Thursday morning, the haze had completely lifted. I was standing in Arthur's kitchen, wearing a pair of his sweatpants cinched tight at the waist and one of my own dress shirts, sleeves rolled up. I was scrambling eggs. The mundane normalcy of the task felt utterly bizarre after the intensity of the past 3 days. The front door clicked open, followed by the heavy thud of a backpack hitting the hardwood floor. "Dad, Aunt Sarah said I can't eat ice cream for breakfast, but my arm hurts." Toby came tearing into the kitchen, his blue cast slightly scuffed, his dark hair a chaotic bird's nest. He froze when he saw me standing at the stove. For a split second, panic seized me. I wasn't the assistant at the office anymore. I was in his house, making breakfast, smelling entirely like his father. Kids were intuitive. Toby would know the dynamic had shifted. Would he feel threatened? Would he be confused? Toby's face broke into a massive, gap-toothed grin. "Leo!" he yelled. He bolted across the kitchen and threw his good arm around my legs, burying his face in my hip. The spatula slipped from my hand, clattering against the pan. I quickly turned off the burner and crouched down, wrapping my arms around his small frame, burying my nose in his hair. He still smelled like milky sweetness and childhood chaos. My chest ached with a sudden fierce protectiveness. "Hey, Toby," I said, my voice thick. "How's the wing?" "It itches," he complained, pulling back to show me the cast. Someone had drawn a crude Batman logo on it in Sharpie. Aunt Sarah's cats kept trying to sniff it. "Probably thought you were hiding treats in there." Heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway. Arthur walked into the kitchen, having just finished showering. He was in his suit trousers and a crisp white undershirt, toweling his hair dry. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the sight of Toby and me on the kitchen floor. His eyes softened. The harsh, commanding lines of the CEO melted away, leaving only the man beneath. "Dad, Leo's making eggs," Toby announced. "Can we have bacon too? And ice cream?" "No ice cream," Arthur said, walking over. He ruffled Toby's hair and then leaned down, pressing a firm, unhurried kiss to the crown of my head. He didn't care that Toby was watching. He didn't care about hiding it. Toby didn't even blink. To a 5-year-old, the logic was simple. His 2 favorite people were in the same room feeding him. Nothing else mattered. "Go wash your hands, buddy," Arthur told him, "then come set the table." As Toby scampered off, Arthur offered me a hand. I took it, and he pulled me up, reeling me right into his chest. He smelled like expensive soap, clean water, and pure, dominant alpha. "Morning," he murmured, kissing the corner of my mouth. "Morning, you're going to burn the eggs." "I'll live." He wrapped his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. "Davis called this morning while you were in the shower. The board reviewed the files you provided on Graham." I stiffened slightly, the professional instincts kicking back online. "And?" "They accepted his resignation, effective immediately. He surrendered his equity stake to avoid a criminal embezzlement probe. The firm is clean." I let out a slow, shaky exhale. It was over. The primary threat was neutralized, but a massive, glaring problem remained. "I need to draft my resignation," I said quietly, staring at the cooling pan of eggs. Arthur's arms tightened around me instantly. "Absolutely not." "Arthur, be pragmatic," I said, pulling back just enough to look at him. "I am your executive assistant. I'm also now an Omega who just spent 3 days in your bed riding out a heat cycle. We cannot walk into that building together. It violates every HR protocol in the book, and it makes you look exactly like the compromised Alpha Graham accused you of being." Arthur's jaw set. The gray in his eyes hardened. "I don't care. I care." I pressed my hands flat against his chest. "I spent 3 years building a reputation. I am not going to be the punchline of a water cooler joke. The boss is Omega. I won't do it. You think I would ever let anyone disrespect you like that? You can't control the whispers, Arthur, and I refuse to be a liability to you or to this firm. I took a step back, breaking his hold. I'll transition my duties to the junior coordinator over the next 2 weeks. You can tell the board I'm moving on to pursue other opportunities. Arthur stared at me. He wasn't angry. He looked calculating. It was the same look he had when he was dismantling a hostile takeover. Fine, Arthur said slowly. You resign as my assistant. I blinked, surprised by how easily he caved. A sharp pang of disappointment hit my chest, entirely illogical, given that I was the one pushing for it. Okay, I'll type the letter today. Good. Arthur walked over to the counter and poured himself a cup of coffee. He took a sip, looking at me over the rim of the mug. Because Henderson wants to restructure the logistics department post-merger, he needs a director of operations, someone who knows the company inside and out, someone who doesn't crack under pressure, and someone who understands exactly how to manage an alpha-heavy executive team. I stared at him, my brain stalling. Director of operations? It's a C-suite equivalent, Arthur said smoothly, setting the mug down. Separate department. You wouldn't report to me. You'd report directly to the board. No HR violation, no conflict of interest. He walked back over, crowding into my space, his hand sliding down my arms to catch my wrists. I told you, Leo, I'm not letting you hide anymore. You aren't going to be the boss's Omega. You're going to be the boss. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. The sheer audacity of the maneuver was breathtaking. He had bypassed the scandal entirely, elevating me to a position where no one could question my authority without questioning the board itself. You're a terrifying man, I whispered. Arthur smiled, a predatory, brilliant flash of teeth. I'm efficient. A month later, the morning air in Arthur's penthouse smelled like burnt toast and expensive coffee. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the foyer, adjusting the cuffs of my shirt. It wasn't a shapeless charcoal suit. It was tailored navy wool, cut to actually fit the lines of my shoulders and waist. I wasn't wearing medical tape over my scent glands. I hadn't swallowed a chalky metallic suppressant pill at 5 in the morning. For the first time in 3 years, my bloodstream was entirely my own. Leo, my cast smells like old cheese, Toby announced, marching into the foyer with his backpack slung over his good shoulder. He shoved the blue fiberglass under my nose. I gently pushed his arm down. It smells like a cast, Tobe. You get it off on Friday. You just have to survive 4 more days. Arthur emerged from the kitchen holding 2 travel mugs. He handed me the black coffee, his fingers brushing against mine. He looked at me, taking in the navy suit, the unbuttoned collar, the sheer absence of the chemical barrier that used to permanently separate me from the world. I smelled like myself, rain on hot asphalt, but heavily underscored beneath it, woven right into my skin, was the dense, protective brand of cedar and ozone, an alpha's claim. Ready? Arthur asked quietly. Let's go to work. The lobby of Pendleton Capital was a finely tuned machine, operating on a very specific frequency of stress, ambition, and biological hierarchy. Usually I slipped through it like a ghost. I was a non-entity, a piece of administrative furniture. Today my arrival was a physical event. We stepped out of the private elevator together. The moment my unsuppressed scent hit the recycled air of the executive bullpen, the ambient noise died. It wasn't a gradual quiet. It was an instant, collective holding of breath. Dozens of heads snapped up from monitors. Telephones were placed back on their receivers. I didn't lower my eyes. I didn't hunch my shoulders. I walked a half step beside Arthur, not behind him. I carried a thick, leather-bound portfolio, my footsteps clicking rhythmically against the polished marble. I could feel the shock rippling through the cubicles. The corporate sharks were processing the impossible data. The invisible Omega assistant was radiating the scent of a fully actualized mate, and the Alpha CEO walking beside him looked entirely ready to snap the neck of anyone who stared a second too long. A junior analyst practically tripped over a trash can trying to get out of our way. I ignored him. I kept my face utterly blank, projecting a cold, absolute competence that left no room for gossip. We reached the heavy double glass doors of the main boardroom. Inside, the quarterly shareholder meeting was already brewing. The air seeping through the door jambs was thick with the aggressive, competitive pheromones of 24 corporate alphas circling each other. A month ago, that concentration of heavy scents would have triggered a migraine and forced me to double my neutralizer dose. Today, it just smelled like a room full of men who were about to get a massive reality check. Arthur pushed the doors open. The low hum of conversation evaporated. Henderson was seated at the far end of the long mahogany table. Several new vice presidents, men who had stepped over the metaphorical corpse of Graham's career to take their seats, were lined up along the sides. They looked at Arthur with the standard, guarded respect owed to the apex predator. Then they looked at me. Confusion morphed into realization, and realization morphed into a dense, uncomfortable tension. I wasn't carrying Arthur's coffee. I didn't walk to the small chair tucked away in the corner by the projector. I walked directly to the heavy leather chair at Arthur's right hand, Graham's old seat. I set my portfolio down on the table. The heavy smack of the leather against the wood echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I pulled out the chair and sat down. I didn't rush. I didn't offer an apologetic smile. I looked around the table, meeting the eyes of every single alpha in the room one by one. I held their stares until they broke contact. A few shifted uncomfortably in their expensive suits. Henderson simply raised a gray eyebrow, a silent acknowledgement of the play. Arthur took his seat at the head of the table. He didn't introduce me. He didn't explain me. He didn't have to. The dense gravity of his presence anchored the room, but he left the floor entirely to me. I opened my portfolio. I caught a faint grounding whiff of ozone and cedar. It reminded me that the man beside me wasn't just the CEO. He was the man who had sat on the floor of an ER, the man who had held me together through a biological firestorm, and the father of the kid who had stuck a poorly drawn Batman sticker on my laptop charger this morning. "Gentlemen," I said. My baritone was clear, steady, and amplified by the absolute stillness of the room. I didn't use the flat, measured tone of an assistant. I used the cadence of a leader. As the new director of operations, I have reviewed the integration timelines for the Q4 logistics rollout. I paused, looking directly at the VP who had inherited Graham's supply chain. He swallowed hard. "We are currently trailing by 4%, I continued, my voice dropping an octave, cold and precise. "That is unacceptable. I have prepared a restructured workflow to close that gap. Turn to page 4. No one hesitated. The frantic rustle of paper filled the boardroom as 24 executives scrambled to obey the Omega at the head of the table. There is a specific kind of silence that drops over a room full of apex predators when they realize the natural order hasn't just been broken. It's been rewritten. That's a wrap on The Architecture of Us, folks. We took a deep dive into the corporate jungle, shattered the glass ceiling of Omegaverse tropes, and proved that sometimes the most dominant move you can make is just pouring a cup of coffee and holding the line. If you felt that slow burn tension, the boardroom ruthlessness, and the absolute chaos of a 5-year-old breaking the tension, smash that like button. It feeds the algorithm and tells me you want more grounded, intense stories. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a chapter. Drop a comment below. Would you have gutted Graham with the expense report or fired him on the spot? Share this video with your fellow readers, and I'll see you in the next one.